We want to actually stop it.
Most of you know me, but I've been a member of First Pres since I don't remember exactly when, but 1980s, so over 40 years. And I've been an elder and a deacon and a representative to Presbytery. And as a career, I worked as a psychiatrist. And I was also a psychotherapist, which is not so usual for psychiatrists these days. So I worked with patients in psychotherapy on a regular basis. And about 9 years ago, my memories of discussing malignant narcissism came to the fore in my thinking.
Good.
Because
We
of
don't start
current
already.
and national
What's the
events.
big, yeah, Tuesday was.
Sounded terrible.
Oh,
So, well. Prayerfully, you know. And pretty much.
And so they've come to my mind again. And the lecture today is going to be on something called malignant narcissism or malignant narcissistic personality disorder. And when I told several friends that I was going to be giving this lecture, a friend of mine, Paul Hopkins, who some of you know was the head of the American Counseling Center, sent me a sermon by his minister in St. Louis. He's moved to St.
Oh,
Louis.
does he? Oh,
He actually, it's hard to find out where he is. He's sometimes in Indiana, sometimes in Missouri, and sometimes in Arizona.
because he gave a talk last year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But his minister, a guy named Miofsky at a Methodist church in St. Louis, had given a sermon on narcissism by chance. And because of that sermon, I have a scripture for us to start with. And I'm going to read it to you. It's from 2 Timothy, chapter 3, verses 2 through 5. And this is Paul writing to his assistant apostle, Timothy. It says, "For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, inhuman, implacable, slanderers, profligates, fierce, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to the form of religion, but denying the power of religion." And the last 3 words in the scripture are, "Avoid such people." And you will see when we get into the talk that because narcissists are people who don't think there's anything wrong with them, who are quite proud of who they are, that they rarely seek psychotherapy. So the treatment section of this is going to be very short, but how to adapt to malignant narcissists in your life is going to be longer. And we're also going to have discussion about it because I'm interested in getting your ideas after I talk about this. Personality, of course, is a kind of a vague term, but it's a way of thinking, feeling, behaving, relating to others. You know, we experience somebody else's personality and our relationship to them. And personality disorders are mental disorders that involve long-term patterns of thoughts and behaviors that are different than what's considered normal in our culture, and that are dysfunctional in some significant ways and cause unhealthy and inflexible relationships, problems with work or social activities that make it hard to deal with everyday stresses or problems. I was not, when I was a practicing psychiatrist, a frequent user of the personality disorder diagnosis, which is in the DSM diagnostic manual. But I recognized that they were there and I could see when people have them. Psychiatry and psychology have developed 10 different types of personality disorders. Cluster A, cluster B, and cluster C. Today, we're going to focus on cluster B. Cluster A is paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. These are people with conditions that relate to those words, and on another occasion, if you're interested, I can give a lecture on those issues. And I'm going to go to cluster C because I want to focus on cluster B. In cluster C, there's the avoidant personality disorder, the dependent personality disorder, and the obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And you can see with some of these, like schizoid and obsessive compulsive, there's a diagnosis, a full diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder, or schizophrenia, or schizoid disorder. But personality disorder sort of means a milder form of that. Cluster B involves 3 personality disorders. Antisocial personality, in which a person has long-term pattern of manipulating, exploiting, or violating the rights of others. Antisocial personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder, which is harder to define, where a person has lots of trouble managing their emotions and their boundaries, and it makes them impulsive and uncertain at times about how they see themselves, and it certainly causes problems with how they relate to other people. Histrionic personality disorder. Histrionic comes from the word hysteria, people who are sort of overly emotional and have use it to get attention from others, and frequently are overwhelmed by their powerful emotions. And then the 2 in this cluster that I want to focus on are primarily are narcissistic personality, and where a person lacks empathy but wants to be admired by others. They think that they're better than others and that they deserve special treatment. And by the way, as I go through this, I would like to invite you to think of anybody who might meet any of these criteria that you experience in your life, either personally or publicly in some way or another. Because that's the issue that we really want to talk about. So, antisocial, borderline, histrionic, narcissistic, and then a special version is a malignant narcissistic disorder, combines several of the ones above it, combines sociopathy, narcissism, in particular.
What's sociopathy?
Sociopathy, antisocial personality disorder. Such a person has long-term pattern of manipulating, exploiting, or violating the rights of others. So they're not able to really empathize, think about other people. They tend to use other people. They tend to not have a very clear sense of what the appropriate rules are for interaction. And
That would be what we call a social panic.
yeah. And so, as I read through this, as I said, think of people that you know or that you have been exposed to that might meet the criteria. And here are the criteria for malignant narcissists. These malignant narcissists have an exaggerated sense of self-importance. They lack empathy. They're manipulative, deceitful, exploitative. They're aggressive. They use emotional and verbal abuse, and sometimes even physical violence. They believe other people are conspiring against them. So think of anybody you know that might see conspiracy everywhere they look. They derive pleasure from other people's pain. So there's an element of sadism in malignant narcissism. And they're vindictive when their self-image, especially when their self-image is threatened.
Or somebody like that, it's like,
You can call, those words are somewhat interchangeable. There's not a fine line between them, it's an overlap. And some of the top causes of malignant narcissism may be people who've experienced abuse or neglect, who've been held to unrealistic high expectations of the child. Interestingly, people who've been excessively praised or excessively criticized as a child. And treatments that have been tried with what?
Is it genetic at all? Or they have not found that?
That's a good question. That's a good question. And with a lot of psychiatric disorders, you see the same disorder in parents. And so you could say perhaps there's some genetic contribution, and I suspect there might be.
Okay.
But the research hasn't been back through. I'm gonna read a little bit more and maybe it'll shed a little light. Having a parent with a narcissistic, to speak to that question, having a parent with narcissistic personality disorder is one of the likely causes of malignant narcissism in a child. So the example of, or the genetic contribution of that parent is somehow playing a role in how that child starts to see and act in the world.
So nature and nurture.
Yeah, it's probably both. Treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic psychotherapy, dialectical behavior therapy, all of which are very interesting areas. And I could also give a lecture on if they were ever interested in those. Couple counseling, family therapy, have all been tried with malignant narcissism and all with very little success. It's not a disorder that's easy to treat by a psychiatrist.
There's nothing wrong with
There's nothing wrong with them.
it.
So one of the first people who introduced the term malignant narcissism was Erich Fromm. Some of you may have read his book, The Art of Loving. He coined the term in 1964. He was a German-American social psychologist and psychoanalyst. He was a humanistic philosopher and a democratic socialist, and he was a German Jew. And he had to flee the Nazi regime, and he came to the United States, one of the lucky ones who was able to come, and was one of the founders of the William Alanson White Institute of Psychiatry, Psychoanalysis, and Psychology in New York City, which is a very famous center, especially for psychoanalysis. And before he left Germany, he was involved with the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. And as I was reading this, I started wondering, did Erich Fromm leave Germany because of a malignant narcissist? Thank you. Erich and Fromm characterized the condition as a form of narcissism, in which the individual takes pride in their own inherent traits, and thus does not require any connection to other people or to reality. Does not require any connection to other people or reality.
Except he was a Jew in Germany,
Yeah.
so.
No, Erich Fromm isn't talking about himself.
Oh, okay.
He's talking about malignant narcissists.
Okay.
Erich Fromm has his head on straight.
Okay.
There was a psychoanalyst named Edith Weigert, who in 1967 saw malignant narcissism as a regressive escape from frustration by distortion and denial of reality. Weigert was a female student of medicine in Nazi Germany, a Jewish medical student. And she immigrated from Germany because of the malignant narcissist in Germany to Turkey, where she was an instrumental player of introducing psychoanalysis in Turkey. And then she moved to the United States.
So is that how you deal with them, is to stay away from them?
That's if you can.
If you can,
There are some malignant narcissists that we cannot avoid.
yeah.
Yeah. Let me take extreme measures, but yeah.
Herbert Rosenfeld in 1971 described malignant narcissism as a disturbing form of narcissistic personality where grandiosity is built around aggression and the destructive aspects of the self to become idealized. And Rosenfeld also was born in Germany, in Nuremberg in 1910, and got his medical diploma in Munich in 1934, but immigrated to Britain because of the Nuremberg laws that were passed by the Nazis that didn't allow him to treat anybody but other Jews. He couldn't treat and then eventually he would have lost everything else, including his life. But he worked in Great Britain and then came to the United States, or worked in Great Britain, worked with a famous psychoanalyst named Melanie Klein, who was very instrumental in a lot of theorizing about different things. And there,
She could maybe equate, malignant narcissism with the whole idea of Antichrist.
that's beyond my pay grade. We'll ask,
Matthew.
another analyst named Pollack, who was treating soldiers at Fort Riley, Kansas, witnessed the psychological effects of warfare, and that stimulated his interest in mental health, and he became an analyst working at Northwestern University in Chicago, and opened up psychoanalysis to new ideas, including enlisting the expertise of social workers, anthropologists, historians, and clinical psychologists. And in 1978, he wrote, "The malignant narcissist is pathologically grandiose, lacking in conscience and behavioral regulation, with characteristic demonstrations of joyful cruelty and sadism." And then the last person that I'm just mentioning that talked about malignant narcissism was interesting because I had forgotten about him. Some of you, how many of you read the book by M. Scott Peck, People, The Road Less Traveled?
Oh, that's a good one.
How many of you read his second book, The People of the Lie?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, it turns out that The People of the Lie, he says, is about evil. M. Scott Peck says, about evil. Remember that, about evil. I regarded it not as about evil because I think there's other kinds of evil than malignant narcissism. But malignant narcissism is one definite form of evil. And in his book, he talks about how malignant narcissistic people are consistently self-deceiving with the intent of avoiding guilt and with the intent of maintaining their self-image of perfection. They attempt to deceive others and maybe don't even know they're trying to deceive others because they believe their lies so fervently sometimes. They project their own, his or her own evils and sins onto the very specific targets that they target. In other words, they take negative things about themselves and they attribute it to other people. Like, there are people out there who are trying to destroy America and our democratic principles. Would be an example of projection. They also abuse political, emotional, interpersonal power. They lie incessantly. They're unable to think about from the viewpoint of their victim. They're active scapegoats. And they have a covert intolerance to criticism and other forms of narcissistic, overt intolerance to criticism and other forms of narcissistic injury. They constantly run away from their own evil, putting themselves in a position of moral superiority and putting the focus of evil on others. And the third person, the last person, the sixth person I want to talk about is a Austrian gentleman named Otto Kernberg, who's a major theorist about narcissism. And in 1984, he wrote several books and articles about how to deal with narcissism and especially malignant narcissism. And he saw malignant narcissism as having antisocial features, sociopathy, paranoid traits, and egocentric aggression. You know what egocentric means?
No.
It's a psychiatric term that means,
Egocentric, it's all about me.
no, it means it's consistent with their view of themselves.
Oh, okay.
They don't have any, it's not something I'm being this way because it's wrong, it just feels right. So they're egocentrically aggressive. Other symptoms may include,
So you deserve to be heard.
yes.
Oh,
Other symptoms include the absence of a conscience and a psychological need for power and a sense of importance or grandiosity. And interestingly, Leo Kernberg was born in Vienna and fled Germany in the 1930s. He went to Chile before he ended up coming to the United States, where he was a major factor at Johns Hopkins in their psychoanalytic program. And then eventually worked at Menninger's Hospital in Kansas. And he believed that malignant narcissism should be considered as a part of the spectrum at the severe end of narcissism.
It's a tumor.
And he developed ideas about being a reflector. So his therapy was sitting with people and reflecting and not confronting them overtly about their misbehavior or their wrongness, because he knew from experience that that broke the therapy alliance down. So he would sit there patiently. I talked to someone just earlier this week who knew residents, psychiatric residents who worked with Otto Kernberg, and they said Otto Kernberg was in the room listening to these people, dealing with them by not confronting them, and the residents had to deal with their misbehavior outside the therapy.
But did it work?
You wait for them to say something? Is that what you're doing?
I mean, just,
Are you waiting for the patient in that case?
You wait for the patient
To recognize
you wait for them to sort of get it,
Yeah.
and you may wait forever.
does it, I was gonna say, does it work?
No,
Simple answer.
Residents, that's why you need the residents, and you also have a new influx of residents, because the
We're gonna be-
residents burn out.
but we're gonna be talking about how we deal with
Yes,
narcissism.
thank you.
And that's what the next topic in my lecture is, how to deal with a person with malignant narcissism. Avoiding a person with malignant narcissism is a key self-protection strategy.
Okay,
So where possible, avoidance is one way to deal, just don't deal with them.
yeah,
Because no one can cure another
that's what
person's
you
mental
said.
health disorder.
That's what you said, avoid.
And those with narcissistic traits often refuse treatment. I remember, I think I've had 3 people in my office as a psychotherapist who had malignant narcissism. One guy was the husband of a woman and she brought him in. He was from Texas. And within 5 minutes, he had told me that he had made so much money and he was so important that, you know, there was nobody greater than he was. And I thought to myself quietly, my usual charge was. I thought to myself quietly, you know, to get this guy's attention and maybe have any chance of working with him, I should probably tell him that my average therapy session for someone like him was $50,000. I didn't do that because I couldn't rationalize it ethically. Now, as I think about it, I do wish I knew what would happen. I would have said, you know, your case is so special. I can't do much for that.
It's like him running the stick
That's
along the.
$50,000 case session. It's only this one.
You should be here for it.
Okay, another method that's recommended for dealing with narcissists, and this is you'll know from events that have happened in the last 8 years in the United States, is documentation. For example, if we talk to the Republican Secretary of State in Georgia, who documented quite a bit, documentation was an important part of his holding his own against the assertions of
They'll just come up with a conspiracy theory that it was AI.
But documenting, and people who are working with co-parenting, sharing a legal relationship with someone with narcissism should communicate in writing when possible and document conversations to whatever extent is safely and legally possible. This prevents the person with narcissism from making false claims as successfully and escalating their abuse by trying to seek out. For example, if you're married to a narcissistic personality disorder, a malignant one, if you've documented everything that's happened, when it comes to court and the custody of your children is in mind, that documentation will play an important role and be helpful in dealing with them. This is not about treating the malignant narcissist. Remember, we already agreed that that's not very possible.
It's defending yourself against them.
A second tech,
Videos in the house to record what the interactions are
Yeah.
going on so that they can see.
exactly.
Yeah.
And if you're a public figure, you get videotaped enough, so it's right there in front of you. A
That's
third
good.
technique that they recommend is one I've never heard of before, but it made sense to me. It's called gray rocking.
Oh,
Gray rocking means channeling a gray, boring rock. In other words, being as uninteresting as possible when you're dealing with a narcissist. Because people with narcissism want a reaction, even a negative one.
right.
And when they do not get it, they may lose interest and go away.
It's incredible.
And then a very critical issue, and one that we're facing right now in many ways, is establishing boundaries.
Hmm.
Individuals with narcissism, they routinely violate boundaries. So it's important to establish internal guidelines. And I've used this myself with a member of my family who was not a malignant narcissist, but who had serious problems at times. I would just leave the room when he would get bad enough. So that's one of the ideas about establishing boundaries. And then the more you understand about narcissism and the more you understand that they aren't really going to respond to rationality or reason, it helps you deal with it. Some other strategies include seeking, when necessary, legal help. And this is important for people who are married or who are working with somebody. And over the next few years, we all may be working with somebody with whom we may need legal help. Interestingly, seeking mental health support for yourself. And one of the things that we know about, for example, addiction and alcoholism, which I was a specialist in treating, is that alcoholism promotes narcissism. So a lot of people, when they're intoxicated, are narcissistic. And so getting help for yourself and not necessarily just them, especially if they refuse it, and then finding peer support. And one of the reasons that I'm presenting this talk today is I'm here for peer support. I want help from you all to help me deal with the malignant narcissists in our world. And that's what I want to spend time talking about as soon as I finish.
Well, in a way, that should be part of the mission of the church.
Yeah,
That's why
It
they have
is.
these classes.
Yeah.
so limit your interactions is one we've already talked about. Avoid being too vulnerable, and we've implied that one. Manage your expectations. Don't expect love, fairness, loyalty. They seem to be capable of that, incapable of that. Let them talk about themselves as long as you're talking a discussion with them. Identify tactics that they may use against you so you can use those to exit the scene as possible.
Oh,
And understand what they may want from you. And if it's something you're willing to give, you can give it, but if it's not something you can or want to give, at least you know what might be a trigger or an insecurity, which is the last item on that list. And then practice self-care and use your support system. And that's what I'm doing this morning. I'm using one of my support systems. That's why I'm here. So one of the things that I'm going to do at the very end is just go over from a different source the 10 characteristics of malignant narcissism. But what I'd like to do for the next few minutes, next half hour, 20 minutes, is talk about whether any of you have had exposure to or experience with malignant narcissists.
I was married to
Right,
one.
make sure, if you have, if you're-
I was married to one.
well, one narcissist.
Yeah.
Okay. So so for those of you who have experience, what can you tell us about what I just said? Does it make sense?
I think, something that did get mentioned. It's very often, and this is a real American trait, I think, where we are born and raised to make a lot of money and, you know, and I find a lot of people who have made that money, they don't contribute anything to luck, you know, the fact that their parents were filthy rich or just a lucky break, you know, it's all their hard work. They've done it all. And you can't tell me how to do things because I'm so good, you know, I'm a success. How can you go against that, you know, and
I'd like to just underline what Bruce said. When COVID started, I used to play, I'm a confession here. I used to play poker And I used to play poker
We're
with
not.
a couple of guys who were actually ministers. Well, some of you may have known Wally Ford, some of you may have known Mark Rutledge, but we played poker together. And then I got in the game, so a bunch of psychologists and psychiatrists got in the game. And when COVID started, we hadn't been playing for a long time. One of the reasons was because Mark Rutledge had moved to North Carolina. And I realized that there was a Texas Hold'em poker game online. And so every Wednesday afternoon, 6 of us get together on the computer. And we have this oval poker table on the screen, and we have a second device where we have a Zoom, so we can shoot the breeze with each other. And then in this game, it's really interesting because it shows how much money you've won or lost. And when I've won a lot of money, I am smart. When I've lost a lot of money, it's just bad luck.
Well, wasn't
Cheating.
there a psychologist that did a study where they changed the rules to Monopoly? Where if you pass go, you get double your salary. And so that it was rigged against one and for another. And that the more the one that was rigged for, the more money they made, the
Yeah.
more arrogant they got. They attributed to
That's it.
themselves rather than the game system.
Yeah.
So.
All of the guys, yeah.
You're reinforcing Bruce's point,
Yeah.
and I think if it's not the cause of malignant narcissism, it contributes to a narcissistic sort of attitude. But it's not the full-blown syndrome.
Oh, but yeah,
Yeah.
It's secondary to well. And if you already have narcissistic personality disorder and you have a lot of money, or think you do, it can make your narcissism even worse.
Is it more prevalent?
Do,
Tell me your name again.
Roger,
Roger, thank you.
do these people, narcissistic personality disorder, do they tend to get violent? Because you mentioned at one point, one way to deal with them is just to ignore them, leave the room. I would think that would make someone really angry.
it does.
Yeah, you have to worry about
Yes.
violence when somebody.
And you have to worry about physical violence, but you also have to worry about emotional violence and other kinds of retribution that might come your way. And that's why leaving the room is easier if you're in a room with other people. But if you're the only other person in the room,
Yeah.
it's really harder to do that. And it takes some,
Be afraid to.
yeah, you have to think ahead of time and you have to develop a strategy for how am I gonna exit this?
And if you get in the car and drive away, you don't know when it's safe to come back. Or when it's gonna have gotten, I mean, sometimes calming down can happen, but sometimes it escalates. And you don't know when it's gonna be safe to come back.
Well, and you have to try and outsmart them too, because when I left, he said, I know where you live,
Yep.
and it was wrong. And so I acted real afraid. Oh, well, stay away from us. You know, you have to outsmart them, or they'll hurt you.
Yeah, in cases of family violence, the most dangerous time for the person who's being abused is leaving.
Yeah.
That's when they're more likely to get murdered.
Sure.
As these narcissists get older, do they get worse? Or they just start out?
Well, does anybody,
Family violence usually escalates.
I don't know. Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I have a brother-in-law who I'm pretty sure is one, and interestingly enough, he's a minister. But he doesn't work anymore. My sister's been supporting him for 20 years. And she says he's better with age. I'm no longer around him, like, I just avoid him because
Yeah,
it's.
that's it.
And then he's cut my sister off many times, like, well, it's her decision too, right? But there's. I mean, we won't hear from her for months, and I think a lot of it has to do with that whole
Mhm.
situation.
Well, I think our government system protects churches. We have Presbytery.
Yeah,
and
no, he
Presbytery can smoke
he's a
them out.
PCUSA minister and he
Yeah.
doesn't work. And
Yeah,
I know
they-
why, you know,
Presbytery.
because he's. But, But she says he's better now. I don't know if that's the case. I don't really want my children or any of my family to be around them. It's kind of a rough.
Well, I have a malignant narcissist in my life at present. And I've known about his presence in my life for at least 9 years, 10 years. And I can't avoid him. Because he's there all the time. And but fortunately, I'm not ever one-on-one with him. I'm at a distance. But I would say he hasn't gotten better as far as I can tell over the last 9 years. I'd say he's gotten worse.
Well, the one that I knew was in a special preschool because the parents recognized it by age 2. Finally died early 70s and everybody was going, still like that, you know, so it was kept on coming.
It kind of seems like something that does feed on itself.
Yeah.
Worse.
I'm better.
I'd like to say that my ex-husband, I don't like to say it, but it is true. I didn't realize that he was narcissistic because we lived grief teams all the time. All the time, and I was like, what's going on? But one time he made a confession that was so insightful to me that I thought, yeah, we are living in a Looney Tune part 2 here. He said, everything I do is an act. Yeah, because he did the smoke mirrors and he had people confused and he would sell this product and that product and then they would tell me, I don't know why I bought it. So, but it's all an act. And it's cruel sometimes when you have a family and children, and I still think they do get worse, or they continue, because it worked for them. I think, but he died, so I can say he's not on. Mine disappeared. He did.
The malignant narcissist in my life, I remember said 8 or 9 years ago, he said, it's amazing. He said, I could do anything I want to, and some of these people who like me won't be affected at all. I could shoot somebody on the streets of New York City, and they wouldn't be impacted at all.
Yeah.
And that brings in another factor, which is what your social support system is willing to put up with, or even adulate, and promote an exacerbation or worsening of this malignant narcissism. And it presents a dilemma for those of us who don't adulate that person, as to what do we do? How do we cope with it?
Well, I left and I know people who are leaving, as in the country, you know, one's going to Ireland and others, yeah.
So when we were dealing with that, I read that book, Sociopath Next Door,
Yes.
and I taught my kids about, like, you know, that personality and that they're ministers, sometimes they're teachers. And what she said was exactly what you said, avoid them at all costs, let us know if you have one. Now my son's commander in chief he's in the Marines and
Yeah,
it's just
Yeah, that's
heartbreaking. I don't even know.
yeah, so is my nephew.
Well, in the field of counseling victims of domestic abuse, the classic insight is that it escalates over time. Violent,
Especially when they drink.
One of the things that kept me working with alcoholism was that I got to know well a lot of people who suffered from that disorder. And I saw a lot of them in recovery. And the difference between them and their full-blown alcoholism and their experience in recovery was dramatic for most of them. There was just a dramatic change. And for the ones who used the program, 12-step program like Alcoholics Anonymous, there's so many steps in the program where you take a personal inventory. You know when you're wrong, and you make amends for when you're wrong. And those are all things that a malignant narcissist or an active alcoholic would never do. But in recovery, people can do that. So if there's an exacerbation of a narcissistic tendency because of something like addiction, treating the addiction can be a really effective way of making things much better. And certainly in a lot of cases of domestic violence, that Arthur's mentioned a couple of times. When the person is in recovery, it doesn't mean that they still couldn't be domestic violent. But it means that the likelihood of it is much less, especially if they're not just dry, but if they're actively in recovery.
I wondered, is it more prevalent in the west than the east? Because we're more individual, rugged individual, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, whereas in the east, they're very group oriented and,
Well, the malignant narcissist that I'm having the most trouble with right now is from the east.
oh, wow.
So I
So
don't know.
they're in necessarily interesting. Yeah.
I don't think they're, several years in Hong Kong. I don't think
Really,
they're
don't
amused.
see.
Yeah.
Oh, good, okay, well, that's good to
So
know.
you don't think our society, I mean, it seems like there's more in certain societies, you know. You don't think-
They do have a tendency to believe in the group much more, and the individual thing. I think America does. We've got it on steroids. I mean, this thing of making money and
Yeah.
succeeding in big business and all of that is out of control.
Pull yourself up by your own straps.
It's a problem, yeah, it's something of a problem. I mean, it's okay, it's good in a way, but it can be, it gets taken way too far, very often.
Okay,
Okay.
well, you guys do your duty.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Be on next week.
When I decided to get this stuff right.
Oh,
I
Bruce
sent,
is on next week. You're on
the
next
stage
week,
of
aren't you?
diagnostic criteria to my family. And my daughter-in-law in Seattle is married, is married to my son, and her brother started out life as her sister. And he is married to a woman who started out her life as a male.
Uh-huh.
And interestingly, when I sent this out, he sent me an email with references to narcissism. He'd been doing his own reading about it. And one of the things he introduced me to was a guy named Paul Levy, who is, writes for a journal that the Theosophical Society puts out. So it's kind of a little bit, I don't know if you know about Theosophy. It was a movement in the United States and in Europe in the early 1900s.
Where do you
And it
see-
was sort of a religion, philosophy kind of thing that looked at certain things and
No, they were still around.
they still have a journal. And this Paul Levy lives in Oregon. And he wrote a piece about the Wetiko, Wetiko, which he says is a creature, an entity in Indian Native American folklore, like the Wendigo is another name for it. And he gave a number of examples, but he talked about it being an infectious agent, contagious. And so when we're talking about this, one of the questions we should ask ourselves is the adulation of a malignant narcissist in our country contagious?
I think, yes.
And what would feed that contagion?
Feeling
Power
important,
hungry.
yeah.
Or feeling powerless, and this is the way to gain it. If you allow yourself
Right.
to suffer.
It's very good.
That is really good, yeah, because I think a lot of people feel like they're not getting their,
Yeah.
getting what they should get,
Yeah.
like, right? Like white nationalism, I think that's where that comes from.
Well, going to family violence, it can also be the woman or whichever side is so downtrodden that they don't leave because the narcissist has the power and you also stay with the safety because they are so fantastic and they are so glorious and you will be safe while you are with this glorious person.
So how did you said you had a malignant narcissist in your life. How did you get away from them?
First
Got you.
yes.
Okay.
Yes. First it was my ex. first I trained the kids that, you know, and how to leave, and then we set up a safe house, and then we finally said to hell with it and got out. When my daughter's psychiatrist said if I didn't, she was gonna commit suicide, and I thought I was protecting them more than I was. We were on 21.
And you talk about Antichrist,
Yeah.
you know, when I think about, because Jenny and I went through something similar, you know, when you've got Pharisees who Jesus couldn't stand telling you the Jewish law says don't divorce.
Yeah,
And my rational brain was like, why would God want me to suffer? That makes no sense.
well, but last 2 weeks, whenever go Corinthians chapter, you know, love is patient, love is kind, love, you know, is glorious, love puts up with everything. If you love this guy, of course you will stay, because Corinthians says.
Of course, you should
And
probably read a
is-
different scripture. from
Brainwashing.
Right,
I'm sorry.
right.
So the abuser is brainwashing the partner that is there.
Oh, my ex went to
And a lot
our
of these people
minister.
are kind of
and said,
insecure in the
"Fix her."
first place, and they can sense that, and that's why they marry.
No, my ex went to the minister and said, you need to fix her. She wants to leave me. You need to fix her.
Yeah, went through similar.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
I'm like,
these
I'm living in a parallel universe.
These are all, there's a father figure, or a male figure, a normal male figure. And so they're taken in,
That's all
they
there was
don't have any,
available.
and way to really judge or evaluate. Person that they marry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, I think a lot of narcissists are very, savvy.
Oh, they're
You
very
know, I
bright.
think that's I don't. I think they know how to play a game, right? And they're very.
And they're Canadians.
Yeah, I mean, Ted Bundy was.
know.
But right, very,
Very
very,
manipulative.
yes, I think a lot of them are very.
But
I don't-
Jen-
So we have, John has a question.
Diane.
Diane.
Well,
I, you know, when you started off, I was thinking of my PhD.
Yes.
So when you started talking, I was thinking of my PhD committee.
Well, academia is full of them.
Oh, that could not be wrong at all.
No, academia is full of narcissists.
No, after they sign your thesis, they're okay.
My opinion, the leader at the top is the one that's very narcissistic, right? And it seems like there's a lot of wannabes that are coming out of the network, out of the woodwork. And so I'm wondering, are these really narcissistic personalities that are coming out of the woodwork, or they're just emulating because the leader just throws it all out there and they go, oh, that sounds, looks like power. I'm just wondering if that's which is which is.
But who chooses to be the person with them? I mean, you know, there are a whole bunch of people who see this and run the other way, and there are others who say, oh, look, and choose to join.
I think it's a
Can't
good
let
question.
them
Yeah, I think that just let me restate it. What I think you're saying, Diane, is there that much malignant narcissism in the world that people want to? Or is the presence of a malignant narcissist that's so prominent in our culture generating more of it, more of the same?
Reverend Jones and the People's Temple Kool-Aid. They're drinking the Kool-Aid.
Question.
If you're not, do they feed on each other, or do they not like each other because they both?
I've heard recently it said that, the slogan, you know, if you can't lick them, join them. It's what some of the high-tech billionaires are doing right now.
I would, my own, go ahead.
See, narcissists in the room and they have each their own side, or do they actually join together?
Well, in my own personal experience, which is what I like to rely on most firmly, the malignant narcissists that I saw when I was practicing were few and far between. For the reason that they don't naturally come to see a psychiatrist to want to change. They were all brought to my office by a family member. And they only stayed once.
No.
They didn't
Yeah.
stay for long, so I didn't see them. So I'm not sure, you know, the phenomenon that we're in now. Where we have a common malignant narcissist, and a lot of people are attracted to him. Is not something that I've experienced before, and I don't know, I think the question is something we need to think about. And one of the reasons that I'm giving this class is so that we together can talk and think out loud and share any insights that we have. Because we're gonna have to cope with a certain amount of malignant narcissism for some time to come. And we need to have a strategy.
Well, what was the Democrat from Louisiana? I just love him. The Cajun from Louisiana,
Oh.
strong. He said Musk and Trump are like two tomcats in a pillowcase, and it's a shame someone can't put them in the canal. He said, you watch, as soon as one outshines the other, it's gonna be two tomcats in a pillowcase. We can hope.
Same distance.
What?
And Eric Fromm and people like him came and escaped from Germany to this country, and people from other similar places come to this country. Now, where are we in this country can go?
Yeah, I think it's a time when churches need to bond together and work together. I mean, we need to have a loud voice and very concrete. And I think we need to reach out to other denominations and figure this out.
Is the General Assembly working on?
I don't know.
Okay.
You know, Becky, one of the things that I would like to do is underline and second what you said. Because I think one of the things that we witnessed is a certain portion of our society almost taking over the label Christian.
Right.
Yeah,
And,
yes.
and at least for some of us, when we read the Bible, we don't see what they're talking about very well at all.
And also, I think that, he's
We don't
creating
see
this.
love, and we don't, and you know, one of the things that when I read the Bible, that Jesus tells me is he hated hypocrisy.
Yeah.
He hated people who were, you know, the Good Samaritan story is a good example of how much he hated hypocrisy. And when he went into the temple, it may have resulted in him being crucified, because when he went in the temple and saw the money changers, he felt that was not consistent with his view of faith.
Exactly, yeah.
And so I think as Christians, we do need to speak up about what we think Christianity is. And don't forget, I was taking a walk with Frank Yates, who's many of you know.
Yeah.
And I was telling him that in spite of the fact that I'm a non-theist, I consider myself an evangelical Christian.
Uh-huh.
And what I mean by evangelical is evangelical bring the good news.
Yeah.
And the good news for me is that Christ's affirmation of me as a person.
Yeah.
And all of us as people,
Right.
and his affirmation of love.
Mhm.
That's the good news.
Yeah.
And that's what I want to bring. So when I see people calling themselves Christians and espousing hate and bigotry,
Right,
and I think that's a very good point, that we as churches need to be more forthright, more out there. We can't be the frozen chosen.
right. No, we can't, no.
But that's part of the narcissistic thing, because Jesus loves me. And so anybody who's like me, Jesus loves. And all of them, you know, Jesus doesn't love them, so
But
it's
Jen,
okay that I don't love
When you
them.
read the New Testament, you don't get that as the message.
No, but that, I think
That's
that's.
That's
you
the
know,
thinking.
without-
Raised in that milieu, if you want to call it that. They take the Bible literally.
Right,
That's
they do.
education and higher education, because this higher criticism, especially literary criticism, will knock their views, you know, on, you know.
They don't.
And so they get very dogmatic about,
They
the
cherry
literal
pick.
interpretation of the
The
Bible.
cherry pick
And that
scriptures.
goes from Genesis, that God created the earth in 7 24-hour days. And then after that, so-and-so begat so-and-so, and you run that out to the end, and then they come out with the earth is like 5,000 years old because of that.
Yeah.
And that's why they're anti-science, they totally close their ears to anything else that would refute that. So,
True.
Lane, I wanted to say that you have given me a different definition for evangelical. Because my thought about evangelical was it is the people who spout, but do not do.
Right.
well, that's what they call themselves.
Yeah.
They used to be called fundamentalists, but that became a dirty word.
But the reason I use evangelical for myself is
It's-
because I object to that. The good news is
Well,
not
that's
that they
not what
stop.
I love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm like you now, I'm a non-theist, at least in the sense, you know, that was right.
Well, you can't serve God and nation. It's an oxymoron to be a Christian nationalist. You can't serve God and nation. You can't.
Well, they have ways of manipulating your thought process.
Oh,
Another, just let me take a little version here, a minute. Since the last election, I've been encouraging my friend Frank Yates to do a CME class or a class at Oasis or wherever he talks,
uh-huh.
or on the confessing church. How many of you know what the confessing church was in Germany in the 1930s? Okay, Hitler, when he came into power, wanted the Protestant church in Germany to be a Nazi church.
Yeah.
And Karl Barth, who many of you
Yes.
wrote something called, with a lot of help from other people, the Barmen Declaration.
Yeah.
Now, Karl Barth was born in Switzerland and he went back to Switzerland and that's how he survived. Paul Tillich signed the Barmen Declaration and he'd been really popular
Yeah.
with people in the United States and they wanted him to come here and teach.
Yeah.
He went and saw a Nazi official and he said, the way you're treating Jews is un-Christian, it's inappropriate, it's wrong. And the Nazi official said, Dr. Tillich, you should get out of Germany as fast as you can. 2 weeks later, he and his wife were on a boat to teach at Union Theological Seminary. Dietrich Bonhoeffer ended up being killed about 2-3 weeks before Hitler died, because he actually was involved with his brother-in-law who was plotting assassination of Hitler.
Right.
And Rudolf Bultmann, who is another prominent German theologian, signed the Barmen Declaration and remained underneath the radar. So you have different theologians who signed these documents, who took care of themselves or didn't, but they stood up against, they stood up. And the
Truth to
confessing
power.
church was what they called themselves. Martin Niemöller was another example.
Truth to power.
And Martin Niemöller was, even at the time he signed the Barmen Declaration, an anti-Semite. He wasn't later, but he was in a concentration camp for 7 years, nearly ready to be executed. But the war was over before he was.
So you're
Later-
proposing a model like this for now.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Amen.
And one thing that I see, which I'm now pretty much off of social media because I just can't either. With our church and more with our church, because I follow, you know, the PCUSA groups. There's a lot of infighting about like whether we did this forcefully enough, whether we said this, whether we said that. And I think that's what they want. I think that's what he wants.
Divide and conquer.
Chaos is causing infighting and we need to stop it and just bond together and work on one mission, like you said.
Well, when we bond together, we can all agree on my version.
Well, well, we out of time, but I'm gonna read the last few things that I have written down here. One is a review of the symptoms, just to remind us. 10 signs of malignant narcissists. They use abuse and discard people. This is from a different source, so slightly worded differently. They are obsessed with power. Everything is personal for them. They hold grudges and take revenge. They take pleasure from the suffering of others. Nothing is ever their fault.
Oh,
They are ruthless in pursuit of what they want. They don't have a conscience. They have many enemies. No one will see their insecurities. Deep down, narcissists are extremely insecure. However, malignant narcissists will never let those insecurities show to others, at least as far as they're concerned. And they will become defensive, lash out, shut down, even try to destroy relationships if somebody tries to confront them with their insecurities or their arrogance or grandiosity. And I just wanted, in case you didn't know who I've been talking about, being in the I just wanted to read a quote from the news,
Oh, good.
from Truth Social.
Oh, gosh. They write about your family.
Jack Smith, following the prosecutor's public release of his final report on the election subversion case, is a lame-brained prosecutor. He's deranged. He's unable to successfully prosecute the political opponent of his boss, the crooked Joe Biden. So he ends up writing yet another report based on information from the Unselect Committee of Political Hacks and Thugs, who illegally and destroyed me, because it showed how totally innocent I was and how completely guilty, and why he puts this in here, I have no idea, how completely guilty Nancy Pelosi and others were. But that's the kind of response you expect from a malignant narcissist. And the reason that I put it in last is because I didn't want to use names. And because I wanted to give you an example of how they lash out.
Well, I heard, Trump at one point called Joe Biden, the Antichrist, which said to me, somebody called Trump that, so he's turning around and calling Biden.
Oh, yeah, that's projection. That's projection.
Thank you all.
What they.
He's gonna be teaching in the
is
fall.
what they are.
What's that?
You're gonna be teaching in the fall. I'll take this.
Oh,
I got, that's right, from these.
There's all these shots, if anybody wants.
Hey, Jimmy, there are good guys out there.
Next week, Bruce,
But Jimmy, there are good guys out
Oh,
there.
I'm not sure if I was, but I would be related.
I have it written down, so.
Thank you.
Wow.
I promised me to be back here in January. I gotta sign off.
Oh, yes, yes. You're up.